Appreciate the introduction. Sounds like an investor relations call. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on the time zone to everyone who's joined. My name is Nick Blazosky, and today we're going to be talking about allocations. So to allocate or not to allocate in planning. That is the question, and today, hopefully, we'll be giving you an answer. So just a little bit about myself here. Nick Blazosky, I'm a senior consultant with TopDown Consulting. I'm a certified implementation specialist with Hyperion Planning and Planning Budgeting Cloud Services. I work primarily within the planning and the Essbase space. I've done multiple allocations projects over the last couple of years. And so that's what's kind of inspired this presentation, is coming up with a methodology that seems to work rather well for a variety of clients, large and small. And so wanted to share that methodology with you. I think it would be an interesting topic. Multiple global on-premise and PBCS rollouts globally. And this is my second year that I spoke at Kscope. Previous topic that I think we have a webinar of as well was on planning application redesign. So if you're interested in redesigning your planning application and are looking for a tool chest of items that you might want to look for when trying to go about a planning application redesign, it's a good presentation. What's fun about this presentation is that I'm kind of giving away some, really very poignant and very actionable items that you can use if you're interested in designing an allocation solution in planning. The previous presentation was a bit more conceptual last year. So, since all planning applications are different, it was more of a tips and tricks of what to look out for and kind of a general methodology. So this one's interesting because we're actually going to give you kind of the actual recipe for creating allocations using planning. And as you can see, work with a variety of different clients. Most recently Iron Mountain, and I know somebody on the call will recognize Quantum Resources. So. All right. So the agenda, we just went through the introduction, and so we're just talk real briefly. For those of us who are of a technical mindset, what are allocations? What's the business case for creating allocations, and kind of how they're used within an organization? We're just going to touch on that. We're going to talk about when to use planning versus Hyperion Profitability Cost Management, or HPCM is the way that I'll be referring to this over the course of the call. Certainly this methodology is going to work in some instances. It's not going to work in all instances. And I want to be very clear that I'm certainly not discounting HPCM as a fine product. There are various reasons why you would decide to go with an HPCM solution, which is very robust and is purpose-built for an allocation solution. But there are other considerations, and we'll talk about when you might consider using planning versus HPCM. And so we've kind of got a decision matrix that compares and contrasts, and will give you an idea of whether or not this solution will work in planning or not. We're going to talk a little bit about embarking upon a design. So kind of what I like to do prior to each engagement that I'm involved in is I keep a running tally of questions that kind of add flavor and context to the conversation about designing a solution. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll get into the meat and potatoes of the conversation, and we'll actually talk about actually designing an effective planning allocation solution within planning. So we'll talk about dimensionality, calculations, web forms, a little bit about reporting. And then we're going to have a little bit of time to talk about kind of a fairly common pitfall, because the example that we illustrate, given that we only have about 45 minutes to talk about this, is going to be from a simple allocations perspective. We're going to go into kind of a common pitfall, which you might see in like a waterfall, or also known as a multi-stage allocation. And we'll talk about how you can potentially solve for that and how we have solved for that with various clients utilizing the methodology that we talked about in the simple solution. And then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. So, all right, let's go and get started here. So what are allocations in the first place? So, essentially, allocations are a way to move around indirect expenses, indirect costs. So some of the indirect costs at your organization might be IT or shared services, rent and telecommunications, office space, corporate salaries, or SG&A expenses. And those items might reside at a corporate level, and you might need to get them down to a line of business or a customer or a project to get a better picture of profitability. And it's just not realistic to necessarily. Sometimes there are expenses that are recorded that really should be applied to a customer, but those expenses could be used across multiple customers. So a great example of this is I worked for a helicopter company a number of years ago, and they had fuel expenses. And they would go to the pump and they'd fill up the helicopter, and it would take a couple hundred gallons worth of jet fuel, and then that helicopter would then fly for various customers. And so it was very difficult for them on the GL side to actually account for the coding of that fuel expense by customer. And it wasn't like they were going and charging each customer for the actual fuel expense. There was a blended rate based on the pilot hours and the maintenance and the aircraft lease and the fuel that they were charging the customer. So in order to really get an idea of how profitable that particular customer and that rate that they were charging for that contract was, they needed to get an idea of how they should allocate that fuel expense to that customer. But at the end of the day, allocations are really, at the aggregate level, are going to have zero impact. So even though we're moving around expenses from one bucket to another bucket, at the end of the day, we're still going to have the same amount of expenses. We're just assigning different owners to those expenses. So you might ask yourself, well, gosh, that seems like a lot of work. Why do we even go through the trouble? But organizations have various reasons. Certainly we mentioned in the last example profitability analysis, whether or not the rates that I'm charging are indeed accurate based on the allocation drivers that I presented. Sometimes it's management reporting, and that kind of comes into play with a lot of what-if analysis. So if I apply this particular rate to my allocation, what will my end result be? Is this account more or less profitable? And then one of the other larger considerations behind allocation, in particular that we've seen a lot of places, is it does drive bonus consideration. And it makes the topic of allocations very sensitive across organizations, because if you're talking about somebody's salary, obviously they're going to be fighting to receive as few expenses to hit their bottom line as possible. All right, so that was just a little bit on the functional background here. Let's talk a little bit about when to use planning versus Hyperion profitability cost management. So just a brief overview of the two products, HPCM versus planning. HPCM is really a purpose-built allocation engine. It leverages Essbase. It has the main engine behind it is BSO, but there is a built-in reporting layer that is ASO that is automatically deployed. It's really centered towards giving end users a lot of flexibility and control over how the allocations actually take place without having to have any Essbase scripting knowledge. So by that, what they've done is they've pre-configured certain common allocation drivers, And for those of you who have used the graphical interface of Calculation Manager, it looks very, very similar to the way that you would set up business rules in Calculation Manager using that graphical interface. And then it has a lot of out-of-the-box traceability that goes along with it, so that you can see how your allocations actually took place from start to end. Some clients really take to the interface and really enjoy it. Other clients find the interface to be a tad bit cumbersome, and that may be just because of their familiarity with other systems. Hyperion Planning, on the other hand, is more vanilla. It's a web and office-based planning and forecasting tool. Of course, those of you who have been in the field or maybe using Hyperion Planning right now know that Hyperion Planning is so much more than just being utilized for planning and forecasting. A lot of people use it to report out their actuals. They use it for various other purposes as well. It certainly leverages Essbase as the backend engine. Unlike HPCM, it does not have a, quote, predefined linkage between BSO and ASO. That is changing as PBCS now has a automatic replicated partition, an ASO plan type that gets deployed automatically that is linked off of your primary plan type, but some of your earlier on-prem versions do not. And it's just generic to fit a variety of purposes. FP&A-centric tool, but certainly on the configuration side requires a lot more technical knowledge, whereas HPCM is really meant to be a tool that is driven by the business. So bottom line, so when should I consider using planning versus HPCM? And so this is the list that I really came up with. And if you're feeling that you hit this criteria, then you might want to consider using planning over HPCM. And so we'll walk through each of these. The first and most important piece that you should consider is my allocation methodology relatively static? Are the allocations that I have established for my organization essentially non-negotiable? One of the beauties of HPCM is that if I don't like a particular driver, or if I don't like a particular methodology for an allocation, I can change it by just updating that driver in the workflow and then rerun the allocation process. There is no technical scripting required in order to update that methodology. It's really just essentially a drag and drop replace. A lot of the organizations that we've been working with, since there's such sensitivity around the allocations themselves, most allocations have been vetted at a senior level, so usually somebody within the FP&A department or within the finance organization has agreed upon and essentially signed off the allocation methodology because they know that it's going to affect everyone's bonus or it's going to affect profitability. And so if they can't explain how the allocations are actually occurring, that becomes very difficult for them. Or if they keep changing, that communication has to keep occurring to the end users. And so if your allocation methodology is going to be relatively static, planning might be a good solution for you. That's not to say that the rates that you utilize can't change. So let's say, for example, that we base our fuel allocation based on the number of hours that customer utilizes a particular aircraft. That's still supported within this planning solution that I'm proposing. It's more like if we wanted to change that particular driver to say it's going to be based on the number of employees that we have. So rates are fine to change within a planning situation for your allocations. It's more establishing what that driver looks like. And we'll showcase the solution and how we structure the calculation scripts as well. But what you'll actually see is that it won't be that difficult for you to update the allocations, even from a technical perspective, the way that we structured them using planning. Dimensionality limitations, this is a minor consideration, I would say. You need to have the measures dimension and the allocation type dimension within the HPCM solution. You're also required to have one POV, but up to 4. So that would be either your year, period, scenario, and version. And then you're also required to have one business dimension, but now you can have up to 13, which if you're at 13 business dimensions, that's going to be a pretty robust HPCM application. So those business dimensions that they're expecting are something like accounts or project. Cost considerations. Certainly an investment in technology and the right solution is always going to make the best fiscal sense for your organization. However, HPCM certainly does come with an additional expense and licensing. Talk to your friendly Oracle representative about pricing and how you can get that incorporated into your package if you're interested in going down the HPCM route. Are you in the cloud? Are you just a PDCS or planning budgeting cloud services customer? If you're in the cloud and you're not on-premise, or you're talking about moving from on-premise into the cloud, currently HPCM is not supported in the cloud. I'm not exactly sure when that's going to be roadmapped in there. I don't even think I got that from the seminars. I should have asked Shankar more directly about that. But anyways, that HPCM is not in the cloud. In addition, familiarity with the planning interface. If you guys are an existing planning shop already, if your end users are comfortable with utilizing planning, and you're comfortable with, you have a technical team or a set of consultants or offshore resources that are comfortable with updating business rules and calculation scripts, I'm teaching them an additional tool that may be overly cumbersome because it's geared towards end users, may not be the way to go. You also have the ability to run allocations within the same application using the planning solution. Versus HPCM, you would have to source that data either from a general ledger or from another Essbase application or another planning application. So these are just a couple of things that I would think of when considering using planning. If you feel like you fit this criteria, planning might be a good solution for you. If you don't feel like you fit this criteria, HPCM might be a better solution for you, specifically around whether or not your allocation methodology is relatively static. Okay, a lot of topics to cover that. All right. Let's talk a little bit about guiding your design. So I mentioned I kind of keep a list of ongoing questions before embarking upon a design. I'm just sharing these with everyone so that you can get a flavor. These are very thought-provoking questions that you can ask your business users, you know, within or the people in charge of your allocation, you know, to give you a flavor for how these are going to be structured. So the first thing I always like to ask is, are the allocations going to be based on data that I have within my application, or is it going to be sourced from outside my application? You know, so will revenue by cost center drive my allocation? Well, yeah, okay, maybe revenue by cost center does drive my allocation, but if my source data does not have the cost center dimension, how am I going to fill that void? So these are just things to think about and to start asking your business about. You know, kind of the first couple of days that we would talk about an allocation solution is we try to nail down what the drivers would be. You know, secondly, do I need to manually input them? You know, nobody really likes to manually input a large amount of drivers. Can we source them from another system? You know, if not, manual input should be kind of something you rely upon as a last resort. Are they dependent on another allocation? So this is kind of where we start getting into waterfall allocations. If your rates are dependent on a couple of allocations that come prior to it, you'll need to factor that into the timing and the order of the calculation scripts and business rules that you would put into place. Does the driver need to be calculated? Maybe I have the components. Maybe I have, maybe I'm looking for a particular statistical ratio that I should be deriving. And maybe that's hours per week, and maybe I have all of the information that's required to create that ratio, but I don't have that stat for it yet. And then finally, do I have all the required dimensionality to represent my drivers? If I'm going to be allocating out to the product level, do I have product in my source level detail, and do I have my drivers out by product? The other thing that I would like to think about, and in particular when you're designing an allocation solution using planning, is to think about the order of your allocations. Order matters, and I think that's going to become more apparent in kind of when we talk about the methodology, and it will make a little more sense about why order matters and how you would structure and set that up. So the risk is, of course, is that we don't want to allocate the same data set twice, and because remember the end result of this entire exercise is to get back to square one, except with those expenses sitting with different owners. Okay, let's talk a little bit about defining allocation definition. And this was kind of like an aha moment when I was very early on in my infancy of kind of coming up with this methodology and talking with some of my early clients about how to design an allocation solution using Hyperion planning. And so I like this graphical representation. For those of you who are kind of a fan of describing Essbase as a giant Rubik's Cube, this is the way that I kind of view an allocation Essbase solution. So, in a perfect world, I would be able to identify each intersection that gets allocated or would not get allocated. And so, if you look at the graphic, the way I think about it to the right here, the areas in blue is the data that I don't want to touch. But everything else in gray is within my application the data that I do want to allocate. So how do I separate and how do I account for all these combinations and permutations of data that are sitting within my application? And so if we look at just a real basic example of maybe a mid-sized to larger organization chart of accounts, and this is not looking at block size, by the way. This is just the number of potential combinations that we could have. So, it's looking at that Rubik's Cube, and this is a really, really big Rubik's Cube, and trying to figure out all the permutations of the data that I have. So if my application has 1,000 accounts, 600 cost centers, 500 entities, and 5,000 projects, that's over 1.5 trillion possible permutations. Granted that I can use hierarchies to limit the scope of that, but it's really going to be impossible to identify all of the intersections that are going to be allocated versus all of the intersections that are not going to be allocated. So in reality, we can't define all these combinations. And sometimes, even to the best of our ability, especially if we're using hierarchies and shared hierarchies to define allocations, we're going to run into overlap. And so this is kind of like a big aha moment for me, is when we first kind of embarked upon my very first allocation solution, we tried to kind of define absolutely everything that would be allocated and absolutely everything that would not be allocated. And we were using a mix of the primary hierarchy, and we were using a mix of the shared hierarchy. And we couldn't come to a consensus. We said, well, this allocation is based on this primary entity hierarchy, and then the second allocation is based on the shared entity hierarchy, and then there's some overlap. So, we weren't sure if we were allocating the same data twice or if we already had allocated in the previous allocation. And so that's where we kind of started coming up with how to really design an effective allocation solution within planning. And so this is just kind of giving you the context of kind of how we came to this problem and how we really tried to overcome it. And this is really the key to designing an allocation solution using a planning system. And so I love this presentation because I'm actually giving you like this nugget of wisdom, and I'm talking it up too much. So here it is, and it has to do with dimensionality, and in particular, the data type dimension. So this dimension is going to be your absolute best friend when completing allocations. It's going to allow you to create clean slices of data in which you can reference and then run your various allocation routines. And what I like about the data type dimension is that it gives me that traceability and it gives me that auditability that HPCM has out of the box that planning necessarily does not. And so the next slide, we're going to walk through how we would set up that data type dimension. Oops, gone the other way. All right. So bear with me here. We're going to talk a little bit about the typical simple setup, and this is just for like a single stage, allocation, not a waterfall allocation. Okay. So this is a snippet for those of you who are familiar with working within a planning interface. I thought I'd throw this on here because I feel comfortable working within the outline. So let's talk about the structure of my data type. So what's going to happen here is I have my first member that I want to talk about is going to be the member called pre-allocation. So this is going to be my starting place of where I load in data. So like, let's say I'm sourcing data from a GL or from another planning application or from both. All data that I receive that is going to be allocated is going to be loaded to the member pre-allocation. It is my starting point. It is my most pure slice of data, and it's never, ever, ever going to change. I'm not going to touch the member pre-allocation after I load it. And the reason that we do that is that we always want to have a quick ability to compare back to at a high level. If I have 1.5 million in expenses that I need that I started with in pre-allocation, I better have 1.5 million in expenses when I end at the end of my allocation routine. Okay. The second component, and this is a guy I like to call allocated amount. Really, you can call it your piggy bank, because what you're doing is you're moving all of your data from pre-allocation to allocated amounts. And allocated amounts essentially becomes your piggy bank in which you're going to be borrowing expenses from and then sending them out to various allocations. And the way that we do that is we create members for each of our allocation types. And so those I like to call allocation 1 through allocation infinity. And I give them a very generic name because I want to be able to repurpose these allocation members if the allocation changes. So if I call it, the shared services allocation instead of allocation 1, then I've got to go change the actual physical member name and redeploy the application, and there's a risk that I would lose historical data, et cetera. So what I recommend that you do is you keep the name very generic, but you make the alias somewhat descriptive of what the allocation is actually doing. So you can see here on my screen, allocation 1 is my shared services allocation. Allocation 2 is going to be my IT allocation. Allocation 3 is going to be my corporate G&A allocation, et cetera, et cetera. And then, so what's going to happen is that each allocation and each succinct methodology that you're going to be baking out of your requirements and design, you're going to be separating those allocations out to give you that traceability and visibility into how each allocation was performed. So once you define how that shared services allocation looks like, let's say everybody received a piece of the shared services allocation based on their revenue. And so shared services might include your corporate AP/AR folks, and they're sitting in a separate office. But you guys have $1 million worth of revenue. That's 15% of the revenue for the entire organization. So you're going to receive 15% of the AP/AR expenses, and that is going to sit in then the allocation 1. And so what we found is, and kind of the emphasis and the reason why we ended up going this particular direction, at least when I was going through and kind of creating this design, is originally I only had one member, and I was trying to blend all these different expenses into just one data type member, and I would have to run one rule, validate it, and then I would have to run the other rule, validate it. And then I realized, this is really not going to be an effective solution for my end users because they can't get that visibility into actually how they receive those costs. And if there's one thing that I can share with you with regards to end users and making sure that they're on board with how they received expenses that could potentially affect the bonus, is they want to be able to trace it and they want to be able to see it. And so if you give them, albeit very sparse dimension, but if you give them this tool to look and see how their actual allocations are broken out, it's going to be very powerful for analysis. Because then what they can do is they can drill into their post-allocated amount, and they can pull up their particular cost center or location or storefront, and they can then see by looking through allocation 1 through 10 what their expenses were and how it was assigned to them from each stage. And that greatly, greatly, greatly cuts down on the number of questions that your support staff who is managing this application has to field on a monthly or annual basis, depending on the frequency of your allocations. Okay, so enough about the breakout there. The final member that we have is my post-allocation member. And so post-allocation, what's occurring there is that it's just really the summation of allocation 1 through 10 and allocated amounts. And so what I'm doing is during each stage of these allocations, and we'll get into this in the calculation section, is that I am actually debiting my allocated amounts by the exact value that goes into allocation 1. So let's say that my first allocation is going to take $10 million that sits in AP and AR, and it's going to move it out to various doors. So what we're going to do is part of that rule is we're going to do a data copy to create our blocks, and then we're going to move these expenses around in allocation 1, and then before that routine is finished, we're going to debit out or clear out that $10 million from the allocated amount. So we're always tying back to pre-allocation because we're always having these corresponding debit and credit activities that occur during each allocation phase. So there will be no question that I will tie back to pre-allocation, which I can tell you is a huge sigh of relief, because then what I don't have to worry about, if you go back to my cube example that I showed earlier, that graphic that I love, is that I don't have to worry about all the expenses and all the revenue and all the other stuff that I'm not allocating, because that's all going to sit here intact in allocated amounts. So anyway, that's the that is the key right there. And we're going to talk more about how we actually set this up on the calculation side, and then how to manage this from a reporting and web form, and how to get our inputs in there. And this will be available for download later, so certainly you can, if you're not screenshotting this, you can take this later. Okay, so let's talk about my accounts and how I would have to structure those. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to have to create certain ratio accounts as well. And we're going to need these for traceability and visibility purposes. I recommend that if you have a statistic which you're basing your allocation on, you create an account for it. Even if it's just a simple, it's revenue divided by total employees calculation. Create a stat account for it. So that way, when your end users are trying to decipher your allocations, and you can say, oh, well, the shared services allocation is based on, this particular stat account, they can then pull that stat account up and then see what that value is. Okay. So let's go through our calculations section here. So I've created I think it's a 5-step process here for how you would structure your calculations when creating allocations in a planning solution. So the first thing that we're going to do, and I alluded to this earlier, and this is a perfect graphic for it, we're going to copy data between the member pre-allocation and allocation staging. So that's all data, so that when I first start my allocation process, pre-allocation is going to equal allocation staging, and it provides you that clean slice of data in which you can essentially borrow those expenses from and then make those corresponding debits in that allocation staging. The second piece is we're basically going to be walking through like the first allocation, so like allocation 1. So we're going to create your blocks. So we're assuming that this is going to be a sparse dimension. It's going to be very, very sparse. So I wouldn't recommend that you make it as a dense dimension. And you could use create missing block on, but you're at the mercy of the planning solution, making sure that you don't overcreate too many different blocks. So if you're already going to be allocating based on a ratio, and let's say you stored that ratio in your account dimension, then you already have the perfect mechanism to create the necessary blocks in allocation 1. And so you're just going to copy the statistical value that you're utilizing from allocation staging to allocation 1. That's going to create the necessary blocks that will then allow you to then take that bucket of expenses and then allocate it out based on that ratio in allocation 1. And then additionally, what I like about this is that if I'm doing like an ad hoc analysis and I only have one statistical value that's been copied in, or only the statistical values that are applicable to allocation 1, then that's the only one that's going to show up in the allocation 1 data number. Okay. Step 3, create your limited allocation. So what you're going to do is you're going to fix on the data or a subset of data in allocation staging. So, this could be like, well, I'm going to fix on total operating expenses for cost center 10 plus total operating expenses for cost center 12 plus total operating expenses for cost center 54. And so those don't necessarily have to be in their own hierarchy. You can run the math within their calculation. So you can run the accumulation within your member formula. And then you're going to then multiply, divide, whatever, by your statistical value. So that will allocate your expenses based on the rate that you've established. And then that allocated data will then reside in allocation 1 to the new expense owners. And just a couple of words of caution on this one. You can't fix on alternate hierarchies very easily. You just can't do like a fix at relative of your alternate hierarchy. You're going to have to look at using the sum range function. So just a quick heads up there. I've tried to do it unsuccessfully, and so you just need the sum range function, and then that will help. Step 4, you need to clear the data that you allocated in step 3. And I think I had a couple of accountants in my presentation at Kscope, and they just absolutely cringed when I said clear data. So I added this: clear data. Are you insane? Because that's the look that I got during the presentation. But remember, we're not clearing data from our starting place. We're clearing data from our piggy bank. So whatever data I move between allocation staging and allocation 1, I need to then, after the allocation is done, is then clear that data in allocation staging. That ensures that I will never reallocate that data again, and I'm always going to get back to my pre-allocation number. So that, yeah, once that data is allocated, we don't want to accidentally touch it again. All right. People are trying to call me. Don't they know we have a webinar? Okay. And the next step is going to be repeat. So to continue to create rules for each allocation number. So you notice that I had allocation 1 through 10. I've worked on this solution where we've had allocations for 45 succinct allocations. I think the smaller and more poignant the allocation is, the better, because you're going to get better traceability and better visibility and audits by your end users. So don't be afraid. I mean, these are essentially, I said create templates in order to create these allocation scripts. I know it's a lot of scripts to create, but really it's going to save you a lot of heartache and questions on the back end when you're getting questions from your end users. So don't be afraid to separate and make these allocations as distinct as possible. Realistically, if you're doing it correctly, these allocations should take no more than a couple of seconds to run. And once you batch it as a rule set, it's really not going to be a problem. All right, so a couple of allocation best practices, and we just talked about this. Create a separate business rule for each allocation. So if you have a slightly separate methodology for one allocation versus another one, just add it as a different allocation number. This will save you trouble as well because, like let's say that allocation no longer becomes relevant. Like your shared services allocation was relevant last year, but now you're not gonna allocate out shared services expenses. Well, instead of having to go in and like pick apart that code in that allocation, all you have to do is disable that allocation. So you don't run allocation 1 in your allocation methodology anymore. Leverage templates. I can't emphasize this enough. There's so many things that you're just going to be doing standard. I am a convert between the classical scripting elements, which there's a gentleman on the call who taught me all I needed to know about classic scripting by the name of Satish, and he taught me everything about Essbase scripting. I am a convert to the graphical interface. I would definitely leverage that for your templates. And then package your business rules as rule sets. It's going to make it a lot easier for your end users to then run and deploy this on a monthly basis. All of our clients that we've rolled this out with essentially just a one-click operator. As soon as data gets loaded in, we do the data copy, we run through all the allocations, and then we run the aggregations. Web forms and reports. Let's talk just a little bit about this here. One of the biggest knocks on planning, is that it doesn't have that traceability. I think if you find that if you go with the methodology that we just discussed, you will get just as much traceability, and I would argue somewhat easier traceability if you utilize this solution for allocations than the HPCM out-of-the-box solution. I would also encourage you to leverage web forms. Not only for the input of statistical data, you've got a great, robust solution that is meant to be receiving end user input. If you need to solicit the various percentages from various business units, there's no reason why you can't treat the web forms as a method to collect this particular data from your end users. So leverage your web form. I've also leveraged web forms and the suppression to give your end users quick traceability and reports on their allocation. So if folks want to go in and say, I don't have time to really create a smart view retrieve, but I want to look at the base level detail and figure out how allocation, my shared services allocation affected my particular cost center, then what we've done is created very generic vanilla reports in which your drop-down page selection is just all the various allocation methodologies. And then your end users can very easily flip through them and basically say, oh, okay, well, this is how I got this particular expense from the shared services methodology. You can also leverage this in the reports. I've seen like a book of reports also being created as well. It becomes a multi-page report where you have reports by each of the allocation methodologies, and so they can see the various expenses and how it moved to their cost center. Okay, real quick, this is a common pitfall, and this is brought to the attention a couple of Paul Hawk, I want to give him credit for this, for bringing this up and asking me to incorporate this into the presentation. And this is regarding multi-stage allocation. So what we've described up until this point has just been a very simple allocation routine, where we basically go through our 10 allocations and then we're done. This is common within organizations, and there's kind of this waterfall example. And so the best way that I can illustrate this is the shared services and IT example. So shared services and IT are both kind of fairly common overhead departments that need to have expenses allocated out to various departmental levels or cost centers or doors. And so, you know, shared services provide services to IT, such as accounts receivable and accounts payable, but they need to receive a share of the IT expense. IT, on the other hand, provides technology to shared services. You know, they might be supporting the AR and the AP back-end system and other parts of the business, and they probably need to receive a share of the shared services expense. So the potential problem is, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Is it IT or shared services? So, you know, the problem is that some of the shared services expenses that were originally assigned to IT need to go back to shared services. Or conversely, do some of the IT expenses that were originally assigned to shared services go back to IT? And so you can leverage the same methodology. And I kind of name this like a nested allocation logic. And so we're essentially leveraging our same design as before, but you notice that we've kind of made it, we've made our hierarchy a little more ragged and deeper. And so let's talk a little bit about how we would do that. So in the first step, we still start with pre-allocation. And then instead of moving to allocated amounts 1, or allocated amounts, we're going to move all of our data from pre-allocation to allocated amounts stage 1. And so then we're going to perform our IT allocation, and let's say maybe there's a, maybe there's a corporate SG&A allocation that needs to occur as well. And so we're essentially then treating this as kind of like a miniature full allocation routine. So then we get to the end result, which is post-allocation 1. And post-allocation 1 is going to tie to pre-allocation. It's just I have allocated my shared services expenses. And so now, so my shared services expenses have gone to IT. I need to get some of those expenses that went to IT back over to shared services. And we've seen this a couple of different times in a number of different clients. And so what you end up doing then is you take the post-allocation 1 and you copy that to the allocated amount stage 2, and then you start the process over again. And then you have your IT allocation, any other allocation. And so the methodology holds true, and you're able to replicate this no matter how many allocation nestings need to occur in the course of this process. And so it's kind of a brief example about how to do that. If you study this screenshot a little bit, I think it makes pretty good sense here. All right. Anyway, I think we've kind of gone through a little bit of overview, and I certainly hope that we've cleared up and not offended anybody who is using HPCM. As I said, it's certainly a fine product. There's just certain organizations in certain cases, various limitations, you know, either from the client side, you know, be that financial or be that understanding of the HPCM solution, but they've decided to go with the planning solution. And then hopefully this is giving you a blueprint for, if you're a good candidate for running your allocations and planning on how to accomplish this. So with that being said, Jamie, do we have any questions coming in?
We currently do not have any questions. People who are in attendance, please feel free again, if you have questions, to type them in the question box on your panel. I know that you did have a couple of questions that were asked of you during your Kscope 15 presentation. Nick, if you wanted to go through some of those.
Yeah, certainly. So a couple of people at the Kscope presentation, certainly cloud is a hot topic right now with Oracle, and they've asked if this solution could be utilized using planning and budgeting cloud services. And the answer is absolutely yes. In fact, planning and budgeting cloud services is really a great tool for this particular solution. You know, obviously some of the limitations, you know, with PBCS is that you get one application, but you get multiple plan types, and with that, you still get your 3 main plan types. With, I believe, the options that are dropping very soon, or if not, have dropped already for workforce and CapEx. And then, of course, you get that replicated ASO, which is a pretty powerful reporting tool as well if you're looking to do management reporting. The other question that was asked is, could this be done using an ASO? The answer that I have for that is you might be able to do it in an ASO. We have run this pretty much exclusively in a BSO environment, and we've done this with fairly large data sets. You know, given the frequency of how this runs, generally, you know, allocations of this magnitude, especially if they're relatively static, are only going to occur on a monthly basis. And so, you know, the frequency in which you have to run these is not going to be that much. And so any performance gain that you would see potentially in an ASO might be negated. You know, in addition, it kind of makes the, I mean, unless you're an MDX guru, it makes the scripting, in my opinion, just a bit more cumbersome, and then harder to decipher if that needs to be transitioned to other owners. Jamie,
we do have one question from our attendees. The question is, with the latest version, is it still 1 calc script per month?
Still 1 calc script per month. Well, what we'd actually end up doing is we'd have multiple calculations. So we would structure this as one giant business rule set, but we would still, I think that what would be the best option, even with the latest version, is to keep these as distinct business rules. And that's more for kind of keeping this closely aligned to HPCM. So, you know, you don't want to have one giant business rule with all of your allocation logic, even if you're sending it to various members. I would still advise you to keep this as separate and succinct business rules, because they can be easily packaged as a rule set. Good question. Thank you.
All right. There was just a follow-up to that question that said, sorry, my question was for HPCM.
Oh, you have that it's for HPCM? Versus the latest version. You know, I am not sure. I'm not completely up to date on the latest version of HPCM and whether or not that would be 1 calculation script. But I do apologize. I'm not 100% sure on that one.
All right. I think that is all of the questions that we had for today. So thank you, Nick, very much for presenting at today's webinar. And thank you much to everyone else for attending our Kscope Encore webinars.